So we're actually going to start out with a couple of questions. This is not meant to be a gotcha. We're just trying to kind of gauge where people are a little bit. And so we're going to ask some questions. When you or your escrow account pays your tax bill this spring, 2023, what year valuation is that paying on? We'll go ahead and move to the answer, which is actually A, 2021 valuation. So there's actually an 18-month delay roughly between your valuation at the beginning of the year and when you start to pay property taxes on that. So for a valuation that you receive for the beginning of 2023, as an example, that will factor in September of 24 and the beginning of 25. So that's a little bit how it works, but it's one of those concepts that's always a little challenging. Next question. What organization or body gets the greatest portion of property tax? Okay, so it is actually the school district. Yep, they receive a little over 50%, and that's true for most of Iowa. Moving on. What percentage of your property tax dollars goes to the city you live in? Well, it is C, 35% roughly. So it fluctuates in any given year depending upon budgets and how tax levies move around, but it is about 35%. And then I think we have one final question. Is property tax the same in all states? A, yes. B, no. Okay, so we're actually going to talk at the end about why. So we have some slides at the end to talk about the differences between states and how that works. So we will share that information. Okay, so thank you for participating in our quick poll. Just a good kind of understanding of where we are. So go ahead. A few quick terms to know before we get started. So there are a couple of different things we'll talk about tonight. There are different levies that we'll throw around. And usually when I'm talking about it tonight, I mean the city portion of the levy, since we're going to be talking mostly about the city component, but that's not necessarily accurate. The consolidated levy rate is the total amount of taxes for all taxing entities. So like we talked about a little bit ago with one of the polling questions, money from taxes, from property taxes goes to the school district, to the city, to the county, to a county hospital if there's one, a cemetery, other taxing authorities, a community college, etc. So there are other taxing authorities. So we'll talk about a little bit how that percentage breaks out too. So there's a consolidated levy rate, which is the total, the city levy rate, which is the portion we control. And then two other things that I'll probably use interchangeably, but I should not because they're not interchangeable. One is assessed value, which is the estimated value of your property based on the assessment process. So that's what you're actually taxed on versus the valuation, which is the full taxable value of your property. So those are two different numbers. And so I'll show you how that works too. Okay, so first off, just where property taxes go. This is ours for this last fiscal year, the 2022-2023 budget. This is our actual breakout for the property taxes here in Waukee. As you can see, there's a total amount of $35.51. For people online, imagine I'm pointing at the bottom number. But so $35.51 total for the taxing entities, and you can see how they're broken out between schools, city, county, other agencies, etc. What's interesting is that not everybody in Waukee pays the exact same amount. For example, if you live in the cemetery district, you're going to pay that extra 1 cent for the cemetery. So it's just slightly different, but very, very similar. So we'll show you some examples towards the end that show that out. Go ahead. So for the 37%, that is the city taxing authority. This goes to 62% of our general fund for the year. So that 37% of your tax dollars comes to fund the 62% of our general fund for the year. And then the other amounts are various other components. For example, licenses and permits would include things like building permits. There are other charges for services and some transfers between, for example, employee funds and general fund, et cetera, that kind of go into the pot. But for the vast majority, or the majority of our general fund is funded through property tax dollars. There are other components of our budget that are things like utility funds. So the water funds, the water facility, et cetera, sewer funds, the sewer facility. But for the general fund, that's the vast majority of what people typically think about when they think about property tax dollars. So what does that go to pay for? And here, what you get for your 37% of your property taxes. So infrastructure and utilities, it helps offset costs of those. Planning and operations, so zoning, permitting, administration, economic development, obviously safety, which some people don't realize includes things like code enforcement and inspections. So if you're inspecting a building to make sure it's safe to inhabit, that's obviously part of safety, but it's not necessarily something people think about. And then recreation, library, parks, rec programs, et cetera. So within that, right, what do we spend our dollars on in terms of percentages? It's easy to see the list and not necessarily think about how much is spent on different components. So for most cities of any size, public safety is well over 50%. So very small cities don't spend nearly as much because typically public safety is provided through some sort of county sheriff, volunteer fire department, et cetera. As you grow in size, you need a more professional and located workforce. And so that does tend to grow as a percentage of budget. And then much larger cities spend even more as a percentage. 21% is spent on recreation, 10% on general government, which kind of includes a lot of those categories we looked at on the last slide. A portion in public works, and which is offset by the other components. And then community development, which includes planning and zoning, things like that. I'm throwing a lot of numbers at you tonight, and I already feel a little bit bad about it, but we're going to do more. So the math on how your property taxes are determined. So property tax assessment is actually a state process. It's regulated by Iowa code. We regularly get questions about things like, why don't you offer some sort of credit for this? That's actually not something that the city can do just by state code. It's a very regulated process. And then it is administered by the counties. So the counties administer the process, but it is mandated by code. And then reassessment occurs every 2 years. So your assessed value remains the same over a 2-year period, even as your value changes in your home. So reassessment occurs every 2 years on the odd year. So you are going to, unfortunately, as of April 1st, get a new assessed value. And so we'll talk about that a little bit at the end. Don't worry, it does not actually mean your taxes are going up. So, but there will be a new assessed value this year. So the assessor estimates the value of property using a blend of various approaches. The one that most people are familiar with is the market approach, where they look at similar properties that have been sold in a similar location and then sort of equalize or normalize values based on square footage, amenities, all of those kinds of things. The cost approach is an estimate of labor and materials to actually replace the property. That has also been going up over the last couple of years, so that contributes to that. And then an income approach. And the three are used in a blend, basically, to create what is the value, the taxable valuation on your property. That, however, is not necessarily the assessed value. Then the auditor or the county auditor will take, county assessor, will take the assessed value, the taxable value, and then there are some things that happen after that. There are multiple components to try to make sure that people's taxes do not go up a significant amount every single year, or that things stay fairly equal across the state. So one of those is something called equalization. where they look at properties, comparable properties across the state and try to create an equalization. So if your property, for example, based on a blend of the approaches in the previous slide was going to go up 20% this year, but equalized or similar properties were only going to go up 10, there would have to be some sort of equalization factor. And then rollback, which is a whole different thing that most people don't really know about. But the state calculates a rollback every year, which is designed to keep assessment growth in check. It is one of the most confusing parts of the process because that number changes every single year. So even if your assessed value doesn't change and our levy does not change, if the rollback changes, that can change things. So that is sort of a bizarre factor. So the percentage is applied annually, and it's tied to agricultural property, which, you know, is a little bit bizarre, but it is how it works. And it's just designed to help prevent growth in assessment more than a certain level. So once you take those factors into account, but once you can see the change in the residential rollback is that column that's in red, and it's over time. Fiscal year 1995, it was 68.04%. It's moved down and then moved back up as things have changed in property valuations across the state. This year, for fiscal year 23, it's 54.13%. Next year, it'll be 56.49. So as it changes every year, even if we don't change our tax rate, that does change overall how much revenue we collect and how much people pay. So you can see that that's changed over time. The other thing I would comment on is that we are a high growth city. And I know you guys all know that, you live here, but you can definitely see that change in the taxable valuation column, which is the third from the right. I don't know that 1995 is necessarily applicable for our conversation, but in 2015, the taxable valuation of the property in the city was $569 million. And we're projecting for fiscal year 24, it'll be 1.75 billion. And so that is a significant increase in the last 7 years. But with the additional businesses, with the additional residents, there's also a need for additional services. And so typically there are changes to our staffing, et cetera, over time, which we'll talk a little bit about as well. So we're going to give you an example because that's sort of a very theoretical conversation that we just went through and seems a little bit messy. So we'll actually give you an example. So for a property that is valued at $300,000, the first step is to apply the rollback, so 54.13%. So then $162,391 becomes the taxable value. That's what the tax levy actually gets applied to. So for a home that has that taxable value, taxable assessed value, and that is eligible for the homestead credit. So a lot of people have probably have had that at some point in time in the past. We'll go ahead and put up the example. So the homestead credit is subtracted out of the initial amount to pay, and then it's divided out. So you can see $162,000 is the assessed value per, and then that tax levy rate is $35.51 per $1,000. And so the total for that property for the fiscal year would be $5,766. But you do subtract the homestead credit, and then that is split into 2 payments. So obviously one in the fall and one in the spring. And so 2 payments of $2,797. So what the city receives is not the $35.51, it's the $13.10. So if you did that same process basically and broke it out, not the full tax bill that you received, but just the city portion, it's roughly $2,064 in annual tax value that comes to the city, or $1,032 twice a year. So what does that actually mean for what you're paying for the city? If you think about it from that perspective, a couple of years ago, we went through a process to break this out. And so it is all on our website and we have examples laid out, but we also then broke it out. So what's your cost per day to live in Waukee? So this is it. That 51-ish% that goes to public safety comes out to a monthly cost of $67.41 that you pay for police, fire, EMS services, building inspection, code enforcement, all of those things, $67 a month. $23.97 for parks, trails, library services, parks programming, those kinds of things, etc. And then there is this sort of funky bottom line. If you look at that of debt service, so a portion of that tax levy is actually designated for debt service. And so that is basically helps fund road construction here in Waukee, but that is not on top of the 1310, that's part of the 1310. However, we break it out because that very much is a separate bucket and we keep it separate. So $44.93 basically a month for building roads. So the city property tax, if you take that amount, the $21.27 for the year, divided out by your days, it's $5.83 a day, which is, we like to say, roughly the price of a medium latte, although I think with inflation, it's actually probably only a tall latte now. It's not really, or Heather very helpfully provided other examples like 2 tacos. So whatever your vice is, if it's not coffee, hopefully there's an example up here that helps kind of put it into perspective of what you're paying every day for city services. And from our perspective, providing funds for road clearing, community development, parks, public safety, public works, I think $5.83 a day. Although we're always looking for ways to lower it, we feel like that's a pretty good deal. I know there are those that would disagree, and I understand that, but we do try to keep it as minimal as possible. So the other question, and this regularly happens when I'm knocking on doors, which unfortunately you're going to see me do this year, I'm sorry, but it regularly happens that I get questions about, well, but we pay more than our neighbors in other cities nearby. And so we also like to share comparisons, which are also on our website. So how does that compare? So the city tax levy, we have broken out relative to Dallas County and then other metro communities. What you can see is that we are in the bottom half for most cities in Dallas County. We are in the top half, unfortunately, for metro communities. We have lowered it 4 times in the last 5 years, and we continue to try to nudge it down on a regular basis. We are also the highest growth city, so that in that list. And when you think about the infrastructure needs and the challenges that we have from growing, it is sort of an offsetting process of we decrease the levy, but we also can't do too much overnight because we don't want to necessarily have to cut services that our residents have always asked us for. We know that it's really important that, for example, you get your bill on time from utility services, or that when you go to the park, it's clean and well maintained and lit and all of those things. So we know that's important, and we want to continue to make sure that Waukee is the place you want to live. And then from a broader perspective, that's just the city levy. When we look at the consolidated levy, because I think that's obviously what most people are concerned about, how much total are we paying in taxes? So we're actually in the bottom third in terms of our tax rate relative to other metro communities. When you combine the city, the county, and the school district levy for each of these entities. You'll notice, for example, that Des Moines, Urbandale, West Des Moines, et cetera, are all listed multiple times. It's because they have portions that are in different counties and they have portions that are in different school districts. And each of those entities has their own taxing levy. And so the total is different. The city levy, we've actually decreased 40 cents 4 times in the last 5 years. And the consolidated, that total levy, that $35.51, has actually been lowered by $1.54 in the last 5 years. And We talk a lot about lowering the levy because that's the thing we can control. We understand that that doesn't necessarily mean property taxes go down, right? And so I know valuations increase, and we'll talk a little bit about that here in a minute too. But that's the thing we can control. So what causes those taxes to change? There are three components. So it's the combined budgets, right, of the various taxing authorities that are involved in that 3551. The total value of all the property in the taxing unit, and then the taxable value of your property after that rollback, after that 54% gets applied. So those are the three variables. If we lower our taxing levy, but one of the other taxing authorities increases theirs, obviously that offsets. If we all lower it, but your taxable valuation or your assessed valuation increases, that offsets. So there are just various components that we all want to try to help lower taxes, but not any one entity can control kind of all the components. And there are obviously market forces at work in terms of valuation changes across the state and across the country. So I mentioned earlier, you're going to get a new assessed valuation on April 1st, and it's going to be a big number in terms of change in valuation. I'm going to warn you now. If you've paid attention at all to the housing market over the last couple of years, prices have gone up significantly. Prices have gone up, materials for replacement costs have gone up. And so when you look at those three kind of methods that they average between replacement or cost and market value, et cetera, it's all increased. And so the blend has increased. So valuations are going up. But if your valuation goes up 10%, does that mean your taxes go up 10%? No, it does not. So there's still a lot. As we talked about, the valuation that you receive now isn't, and you won't actually pay anything on it until next September. And there's a lot between now and then that changes. One of the things that changes is going to be that rollback percentage. It's going to be our budget and how we try to change the levy. So there are a lot of things that change between now and then. And so that percentage increase doesn't equal a percentage increase in taxes. So go ahead. So here are two examples we've included. The first one is for a home purchased in 2012 for $265,000. This homeowner, and these are actual properties in Waukee. The homeowner sold that property for about an 80% increase 10 years later. In 2022, they sold it for $435,000. The valuations, you can see in that second row, assessed value moved across, right? In terms of in 2017, it was $335,840. You can see that in 2018, it was the same amount. So that's that 2-year process that we talked about where your assessment stays the same for 2 years. So then it increased in 2019 and then again in 2021. So you can see your valuation increase or decrease increases in those odd years too. So about 5% increase over those 5 years. The tax rate per thousand went down. So from 3704 to 3549.50. And the actual property taxes went down as well. So not every year, right? You have changes based on what's happening with the rollback. You have changes in various components. So anytime when you see that number, even though, so look at 2017 to 2018, the valuation stayed the same, the tax levy went down, and yet the amount paid went up. And that's that rollback. It changed in those years. So that does happen, but the actual taxes paid decreased, even though the valuation increased, almost $18,000, the taxable valuation, the actual value of their property increased much more significantly, as you can see by what they sold it for. Next example is not quite so happy. Taxes did not go down, but some of the older properties in Waukee have had very significant valuation changes in the last several years, just as desire to live here and lack of housing stock has really impacted how much people are willing to pay for properties. We've seen that tremendously kind of across the board. And this is one of those properties that, that definitely had that happen. In 2017, the valuation was $144,770. And in 2021, it was $186,000. So it was an increase of 29-ish% almost. The tax rate went down, but the taxes paid did not increase 29%. It increased 20%. And I know that still sounds like a big percentage, and it absolutely is. We agree. But if you look at the dollar change, so from 3218 to 3406 from year to year, it's the dollar change isn't quite as impactful. However, our goal is always to continue to lower the levy to help try to offset some of those valuation increases. So the cost to run a city is similar from state to state. We talked earlier about how property taxes are not the same between Iowa and other states. However, the revenues that cities have to generate is very similar. If you look at cost to run a city per capita, it's very tight state to state. So here are some examples. Obviously, Waukee, and this is for the current year, 2022 to 2023. Waukee had a little over $26,000 at 26,000 people as an estimated population, and our general fund budget expenses were $21.4 million. Liberty, Missouri had 30,000 people, and theirs were $24.2 million. So if you look at the kind of the per capita cost to run the city across the board, with the exception of La Vista, which is actually kind of an expensive place to live, apparently, and a few others that are a little cheaper, are right around that $800 per person to run a city. Because at the end of the day, all cities need to hire public safety team members. We need to have roads that work. And as you can tell, we're in similar locations. So at some point, we're going to have to shovel snow. Those are all things that have to happen no matter where you live, and they are services provided by the city. And so those costs are not all that dissimilar. However, if you are in, for example, Liberty, Missouri, your property tax bill will be quite a bit lower than here. But why? So in Iowa, the primary revenue sources for cities are property tax dollars. Licenses, permits, and fees, we saw that earlier on that dollar bill where we broke out 62% comes from property taxes, et cetera. In neighboring states, there's a much different revenue generating scheme. I don't mean to call it a scheme, plan, a code, per code. There's a much different revenue generation platform than here in Iowa. In neighboring states, there are property taxes do fund a portion of city revenues, but there are also other things. For example, sales tax. I mentioned Liberty, Missouri as an example, and this one I researched based on a resident question, so I actually know this one a little bit better. They receive $6 million a year from the state in terms of a sales tax share. We don't, and they receive $3 million a year in franchise fees. We don't. So other states have options for local restaurant taxes. They receive a portion of the lottery funds, gasoline tax, state aid. There are other components to differing amounts that other states allow cities to charge, or that the state's revenue share back. And because those percentages change, that's how they fund their city. And so property taxes are lower. What I would like to stress is that residents still pay those costs. Right? So even though you're paying less property tax and your bill is smaller that you get directly from the taxing entity, whether it's a county or whatever in the other states, you're paying those costs in other ways, whether you're paying for added gasoline tax, added road use tax, added franchise fees on your utilities, whatever it is. I know some states have really high use taxes on luxury goods, for an example. So you buy a boat and you pay 25% tax on that instead of the normal, and that goes to help fund city operations, as an example. So residents do pay for those, it's just not a direct bill. So it probably feels a little bit better than paying the property tax here. So one of the questions I received is, is there no discount on property taxes for those 65 or older? So not that the city can offer, as we talked about, it's a state process. However, there is actually a state credit that is offered for seniors. And so you do have to file for it and then submit that paperwork, and it is administered by the county, but you can actually file for a senior credit on your housing, on your property taxes. The state legislature is currently in discussions around potentially increasing access to that credit or increasing the amount of the credit. Nothing has been decided on that yet. If taxes are used for new ventures by the council, do the people of Waukee vote as to whether or not the venture should proceed? So I want to make a comment just really clearly and very directly. We do not increase our taxes in order to fund ventures. Now, I won't say we never will. There could be a crisis someday, right? Something that we're not seeing, but we actually try really hard to plan for these things ahead of time. We have 10-year plans. We have 5-year comp plans about our infrastructure. We try to fit things in where they'll fit from a budget perspective so that we don't have to increase taxes. All of those things are really very thoughtfully organized ahead of time so that they don't impact. The vast majority of what your property taxes fund from a new venture perspective is going to be some of those infrastructure components. So that would be new road, et cetera, and that debt levy that you saw. When we talk about additional things like parks or trails, those have a portion that is budgeted for from the general fund, but the majority of those dollars actually come from local option sales tax dollars, which was approved by the voters 5 years ago. So there is a 1-cent sales tax in Dallas County that does get meted out, and that actually funds a vast majority of our parks projects. It will also help fund our new public safety building that will start construction on this fall. So there are a lot of things that helps fund, but we try to make sure that we're not taking from property tax dollars where not appropriate. But one other thing on that, if there were a new big venture that would require, that's not a required general fund expense, and I'm saying that completely wrong, and Linda will correct me later, it's fine. But if there was something, for example, I regularly get asked for a pool. If we were going to want to try to build something like that, a large new facility that would require dollars that are outside of our plan, that would go to a public vote, that would go to a referendum. Property valuations and disparity between homes. So I hope we talked a little bit about that too, where the county assessor looks at those 3 different methods and tries to average, but it's not exactly perfect. One of the questions here says, how do you guys handle exact same size properties and plans, but they have different tax values due to the fact that the homeowners did not notify the city about projects like finished basements. So yes, that does happen. We would like for it not to. It's in everybody's best interests that you file a building permit and we can actually inspect and make sure that your contractor or that you did the wiring correctly and those kinds of things. We would prefer that occur, but it does happen where people have projects that add to the value of their home that did not get on our radar somehow. There's really not necessarily any way to catch that until that property owner would go to sell the home. The county doesn't go out and come into your home and assess whether your value has changed. We don't come out and go into your home and assess whether the value has changed. If a building permit's filed, that does flag a process with the county assessor and that does change your valuation. If it's not filed, it doesn't happen. However, it's in a property owner's best interests to eventually have that assessment changed, and because they cannot list their home with that improvement if it's not on their assessment. So if they've finished their basement and added to the square footage, usable square footage of their house, they cannot actually list that in their property description, sorry, until they true that up. There's a question about taxes for sidewalks. We do not tax for sidewalks. There are some blocks in Waukee that are original to the city that are a little bit older areas that do not have sidewalks. They don't have curb and gutter. We are aware of that. However, assessments to change that are a different thing than taxes. That would actually be a decision to assess the property owner a separate fee in order to pay for that. It's not something we typically like to do because it makes basically people's homes become unlivable. If you have a $100,000 home and we're assessing you a $35,000 fee to add curb and gutter and a sidewalk, usually people can't afford that. And so we try to be very thoughtful about that. It doesn't mean it will never happen, but we try to be very thoughtful about that. That is separate from taxes.
The assessed value changed 2017 to 2018, where we've talked about that being 2 years. So they were wondering why that is.
I believe that's actually because the property was sold in 2018. So when a property is actually sold, there is sort of a process that changes. But good catch on the math.
What percentage of the challenges to the assessed value of the Waukee actually were successful in changing from the last process?
I don't know. That's something I might have to get back to you on as well. So there is actually a process by whereby you can challenge the assessed valuation of your home. And so if you receive a valuation increase that looks incredible and you know that similar properties nearby have not necessarily sold for that, you can challenge that through the county. Statewide, do you have any thoughts on that? Nope. Okay. I have somebody who works with the counties in the room, so I was going to phone a friend, but we're going to have to get back to you. So Chantal?
Hi, yeah. We just new immigrants, so it might seem like a silly question, but the property taxes that are payable twice a year, we have a mortgage. How do we pay it? Do we pay the council? Do we get a bill from you guys, or because we haven't yet paid?
Yeah,
because it's a brand new house.
Yeah.
But how do we pay that amount?
Yeah, you don't is the short. I mean, you do, but you don't have to pay directly. If you have a mortgage, you most likely, and I don't want to necessarily guarantee, so you should review it, but you most likely have an escrow account. And,
yes.
And that gets, the property taxes actually get paid out of your escrow account. So what you pay into for your mortgage every month goes to cover both your principal, your interest, your mortgage insurance, if you have that, and then the property taxes. And so that all gets paid out of the escrow account, most likely, but I would recommend you verify.
Thank you.
Yes, please add.
Can I just add something to that? Because I know she said it was a new house.
Okay.
So as the mayor had mentioned, on new homes, again, it's approximately an 18-month period before those taxes are going to become due. So if it's a brand new house, in your case, your tax bill could be very minimal, like $100 or less. But what I would caution you with is a year and a half from now, check in with your mortgage company, because if that's factored into your mortgage, you will see a pretty significant increase on a monthly basis into your mortgage, because the mortgage company doesn't necessarily catch it until after that process has occurred. So just keep an eye on that, particularly with if you do have a mortgage and the escrow is a part of that mortgage.
You don't want to be caught flat-footed later, but it should come out of your mortgage.
Yeah.
At the beginning of the year, there was a news story that the state miscalculated taxes. How does that impact the city? And ultimately, how does it impact the property?
So what was miscalculated last year was actually the rollback number. So the number that we received from the state was different, and they apparently recognized the error, but in order to take action on it, it had to be a legislative action. So it had to wait until this legislative cycle started in January in order for them to be able to fix it. And so they didn't send us a new number until, well, it was quite a while, actually, even though we kind of knew about it in January. So when we were starting to do our budget for fiscal year 24, which starts this, or for the next fiscal year, we are starting to do our budget, which typically has to be filed in the spring. It got delayed this year because of this issue, which typically has to be filed. We had been basing it off of a different rollback number. And because of that, we had actually planned to lower the tax levy again this year. We can't actually do that because the second number that we received decreased the revenues we were going to get by about $400,000. And we also know that while we might be able to make some changes and eat that $400,000 this year, we're expecting additional changes next year. That rollback number is going to change again next year pretty significantly because of those increased valuations you guys are going to receive here. Because of that, they're going to decrease that. And so we know that's going to change, and we're going to have to make some decisions around budget for next year. And so, so we decided to go ahead and keep the levy the same for this year and look to make some tougher choices in our next budgeting cycle as we get more clarity into what those numbers might be. So every city was facing it. West Des Moines, I think they had a $1.7 million negative impact. Ankeny was very similar. Des Moines was much more. So I guess we should count ourselves fortunate at the 400,000. But yes, every city in the state faced that same issue. So because of that, they have delayed the filing deadlines for the budget. So normally we would have already had our hearings on the budget here in March. We've delayed them until April because we don't have to file till May. So we've gone ahead and we waited to make sure that the numbers didn't change again and that we had everything in alignment for that. So we're coming up on our budget hearings here in April. I'm going to repeat that for the people on Zoom in case they couldn't hear, since I'm mic'd and you're not. Yeah, so this slide, actually, that rollback number that's down at the bottom is the wrong number. That was the one we were originally given last fall, that 56%. It got moved back to 54. And so actually this tax rate number, this 1290, that was what we were originally intending to lower it to, and we can't. So it'll be 1310 again next year.
Talk about the increased cost of rapidly growing. Speak to maybe the difference between one-time expenses, things like infrastructure, and ongoing. So we know that new valuation will come on,
right,
with development. So with a larger tax base, you spread out the costs. So the other side of that is what are one-time expenses and what are ongoing expenses?
Absolutely. So, you know, ongoing expenses are obviously employee costs, in electricity to run facilities, all of those kinds of things that if you think about fixed versus variable and one-time versus ongoing, yes, there is very much a difference. Most of our one-time costs, our largest ones, are going to be infrastructure related. There are some other ones, but most of our one-time costs are going to be infrastructure related. And something that I think most people don't realize is how much infrastructure costs. As an example, I meet with a lot of community groups, especially like student groups and Boy Scouts and Girl Scouts, and they're always doing like their civics merit badges and things like that. And so one of the questions I always ask them is, you know, just recently we built 4 roads to go to the new high school. How much do you think those roads cost? And sometimes I get like $100,000, and you know, no. So, but people have very little understanding of that, especially when they're little. But so actually, those roads, as an example, cost approximately $25 million to build. Now, this the school funds the schools. We have to still though fund the infrastructure to go to the schools, even though we try to work with them to make sure we're cost sharing where appropriate. And so all of that is a great partnership, but those costs do matter, and they're part of those infrastructure dollars, that debt levy that we talked about, that helps fund long-term. A lot of those infrastructure costs are going to be one time, but they're large. obviously. Our new public safety facility is very much needed, and we're incredibly thrilled about it. It's going to be a large one-time cost. And so we know those ahead of time. We try to plan for those ahead of time as much as possible. And so that's where our comprehensive plans come into play. And then trying to obviously manage those projects in the right years where we have the funds available. Well, with that, I just really appreciate you guys being interested and wanting to learn and wanting to come tonight.